Hello, my name is John Mayer, and I'm the Executive Director of CALI, the Center for Computer Assisted Legal Instruction. The video you are about to watch is from the annual CALI conference held at the University of Michigan School of Law in Ann Arbor, Michigan on June 4th and 5th, 2026. Most U.S. law schools are members of CALI. CALI publishes over 1,400 interactive tutorials that teach the law to law students. Faculty can also use LessonLink to create formative assessments using CALI lessons. CALI publishes casebooks by paying law faculty to write and review books that can be adopted in many courses in law school. These books are free to download from our website, or print versions can be purchased at near cost. You can download the PDFs or even the Microsoft Word versions of most of our books and add your own commentary before distributing to your students. $300 casebooks are a thing of the past, and adopting one book from CALI saves you more than your entire institutional membership. If you would like to learn more, email me at jmayer@cali.org. I would be happy to visit or zoom into your school to talk about CALI.
Thank you, everyone. Aloha from the sunny state of Hawaii. I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to see some familiar faces that I know. I'm Brian Huffman. I'm the Electronic Services Librarian at the University of Hawaii. I've recently taken on a role as Director of Faculty Development, and I'll bring up why that's important for this discussion. So Benjamin is going to introduce, I'll have to introduce a introduction of him just a little later, but he's going to co-present with me. In fact, he is really going to present. He's the one who's got the show here and knows all the information. So you may have thought staffing problems. Is this an HR issue? Is this something? No, this really has to do with AI and a topic that hopefully is near and dear to you or some of your colleagues at law school as to how they find resources for their scholarly publications. And my work on that has increased a lot in the last year or two as faculty development developer, I can't even talk today, Director of Faculty Development. And what I have done in my past that kind of brings some groundwork to this is I started out by just helping my faculty promote their scholarship. What does that mean? How do they, how do people find their scholarship? What is their scholarship? How does it intersect with all the work that's being done in our upper campus or other locations? And what are the statistics for the downloads and the usage of their scholarship, et cetera? That was my big gig about a year ago. But then now, of course, they say, well, Professor, we have a lot of new faculty, and they don't really know where to get their, they're in Hawaii too, which is kind of its own isolated location. So how do they get their work out there? How do they find where they can get their work published? And that's where the grain that started this discussion occurred. So I would ask you, as potential faculty members who have had scholarship or support faculty, where do you think they do find the people and the resources that want to publish their work? Any answers? Anyone have any ideas? Largely speaking, where do you think they find these things at? No, where do they find the calls for papers? The people who want to actually publish their work? Yep, yep, exactly. You got some answers right here. Yep, exactly. But yeah, you're right. It's changing, isn't it? But in truth, many different locations, right? No one location at all, right? And some are not on the internet, as you just mentioned. So, I mean, how do they find this? Or is there some way to help them collate and get it all together? And so the historical past of that is there were a couple locations, and we put them up here. And I apologize to anyone who may be in the room who may have worked on those projects or know someone who does, because I don't have a lot of background on it, but these were the two, the Legal Scholarship blog, the Calling All Papers. I might inform you, if you didn't know this, that some LibGuides and some research guides still use these resources. They send people to these. These resources are no longer being curated. They don't work anymore. So those LibGuides need to be cleaned up. But these were the two locations where a lion's share of the call for papers were being housed and curated, but no longer true. So that's where we come into play, where a colleague of ours who was trying to get his work out there and trying to find locations for his scholarship said, wouldn't it be cool if we could use AI to somehow help us with this project? if it could help us either gather it or compile it or find it for us. And so that's where Benjamin comes into play here. Benjamin has a PhD in philosophy from the University of California, Irvine, and is a proud graduate of our law school, 2025. He serves as our innovation fellow. It's kind of a new position. We've only had it for a couple of years at the law school. And he helps develop what we call technology-based initiatives to connect students with the legal community and while collaborating with faculty, courts, law firms, and the Hawaii State Bar. So also, please be kind to Benjamin. This is his first Cali, so he's a new Cali conference attendee, and I'm going to hand it over to him to share with you how he made this project come to life.
All right, thanks, Brian. And oh, that's right. Thanks, Brian. Is this working? All right. Now, so Guy Rubenstein, he was the criminal law professor who sent me an email in just this past December asking to meet with me about a project idea he had. And when I went to his office, I was, I have to say, pretty surprised. You see, he came to us from the center of the world, which of course is Cambridge, Massachusetts. And as a consequence of now being thousands of miles away and in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, he had to lean rather more on the technological tools that were available in order to find opportunities to publish and to attend conferences. And when he stopped being able to get into calling all papers, well, I suppose that was the last straw. He was doing some pretty clever Googling, among other things, like I imagine, checking the listservs and the various other ways one might attempt to gather opportunities like this. And what he wanted was, something kind of like calling all papers. I will have to say that when I met with him, I did not fully appreciate what that involved. I thought, okay, well, I'm looking at the Wayback Machine, what this site looked like. It's like, okay, well, there's a web front end here. Okay, well, we can, we need to collect these calls somehow. But that's a solved problem, right? It's just a web scraper of some kind. How hard could it be? Sure, I'll do it. It's like I always underestimate the time it takes to do these things. So, it's not going to be a weekend. Maybe it'll be a couple weeks, Well, no. So I was thinking about this, and I quickly realized as I just, started to make my first forays into building this, that I should not have, I should not have accepted this so quickly because, well, it's not just a matter of scraping some websites. So first of all, the scraping itself is kind of, it's not trivial because we don't want the whole website. We just want the parts that matter, the posts on the blogs where announcements might be made and so forth. And, so, all right, we need different logic for a WordPress site, Blue Sky posts, bespoke HTML. If we're really lucky, there might be an RSS feed. Of course, it turns out that a lot of those RSS feeds are not actually used. But, that was actually the easier problem because, just a lot of work could have eventually resulted in the scrapers that were necessary to do this task. The harder part, well, it's stuff that is trivial in a certain way, like what's the event or publication here? Is this actually a call for papers? What exactly are they asking for? When do they want it? Just stuff like that. That's really obvious if you just read the thing. But reading the thing is not just a, branching flowchart of program logic. That requires looking at it, having some basic ability to understand language and interpret it, having some basic contextual understanding of what, a call for papers even is, and then, writing a little note that might be posted on a website. And that's not a weekend, that's not even, I don't know, a couple months. That's, at least as far as I could tell, that's just reading and writing just until I decided I could not sustain this anymore. And that was when I fully appreciated what it was that Calling All Papers and Legal Scholarship blog were really doing. This was real work that required real staff to spend real time doing. And it evidently was work that, for the powers that be, did not receive the kind of support, perhaps, that was commensurate with its importance to the people who depended on this kind of service, the faculty. And so eventually, well, people move on, people retire, and then these things are frozen in time until eventually someone just stops paying the hosting bill and you get certificate errors, and then eventually it goes offline entirely. So, and I will have to say, all of the, if there are any mistakes in the dates or the characterization of the publications, that will be my fault rather than Guy Rubinstein's, because it was my laziness that inspired this, idea. Oh, well, we'll just have AI do it all, right? AI can read. AI has a basic understanding, of what a call for papers is. We'll just build a list of sites and we'll just send the whole page to AI and give it some instructions. Read it. Is this a call? Extract some basic information, categorize it. And there were other things that were very important that I figured, well, I'll just punt on these, but they turned out to be kind of, more significant. So, I mean, what if this is a blog? The blogs are absolutely the best sources, like Prof's blog, and those have multiple calls per page. What if, there are duplicate calls? Sometimes you have two sources that both post about the same call. And, there are other concerns, like I started to be curious, later on, whether, well, can we determine more about this publication? Is this, for example, a peer-reviewed publication? And finding information about the event, publication, venue, and so forth. Even something as simple as the deadline turned out to be rather more complicated than I had expected. The thing is that in order to chase down a call from, say, a blog, that posts part of an announcement, but that doesn't have all of the details, and this was the most important capability, it turned out. It was not enough to just have understanding. We needed the AI to be able to do research. Not, any kind of heavy-hitting research, but to be able to pursue a lead until it acquired all of the details. And the thing is that research isn't just reading and writing. Research is an act. You have to do stuff. You have to acquire information that you don't already have. And if you want your language model to act, you need to set it up as an agent. An agent is just a language model that's set up in a loop. So it will consider what to do based on the information it's provided, the original source page, the blog post, for example, and then it will decide it will decide on some action, and it will then click on a link. This is a capability that needs to be done separately. Language models, they can't actually do anything. They're not capable of acting. And so the way you have to set this up is you have to set up this, magical reality where they can cast a spell. They say certain magic words, and this is called a tool call. And normal dumb program logic, which is just listening for these magical invocations, will identify this in its dumb, programmatic way and cause the computer to do something. In this case, click on a link. And then it returns what the browser finds back to the agent. And the agent now has new information, and it can then decide whether it has the information that it needs. And if not, if it hasn't achieved its goal, then it will then go back to the beginning. And this is what folks will generally call a react loop for reflect and act. And the reflect part makes more sense when you're thinking, about the part of the loop where it has already acted and is now considering what it has seen. It's reflecting on what has been returned to it in order to decide whether it needs to act again. But at the beginning of the loop, it's more of a planning step. Now, agency introduces some new kinds of failure modes, you might call them. So an agent that has to do stuff might be at a loss about what to do. What do I do now? The agent doesn't understand what to do. It gives up, or more often what it will do is it'll start thrashing, which is to say, it tries the same thing or minor insignificant variations of the same thing over and over again. I don't know about you, but I have to confess this felt like not so much of an AI pitfall as maybe a pitfall of anyone who's ever tried to do something and perhaps not been sure what to do and thought, well, if I just try again, maybe it'll work this time. Well, apparently we're not the only ones who fall victim to that kind of thinking. Now, the other kind of problem that agency gives rise to is, well, oops, I forgot. So agents, because they need to do stuff, they need instructions on how to do things. And if you give them too many instructions, then they become less consistent about doing them. They become kind of unreliable, especially after they start doing stuff. The more information they have to keep track of, not just their initial instructions, but all of the sites that they've now viewed, the harder it is for them to sort out what it is they need to do now. And so, they just become worse at following instructions. Now, one of the things that I was concerned about, and that I did not, again, completely think through at the outset, was the price of using AI for this purpose, because you have to pay the AI provider if you want to use their models. And so I chose Claude Haiku from Anthropic, which is their cheapest, dumbest model. Now, it's a Claude model, and the Claude models are all very good. But Haiku has its limits. And a cheap, dumb model is going to be a model that gets to the questions, what do I do now? And oops, I forgot, faster than more capable, more expensive models. So, one solution would be to just bite the bullet and get a more expensive model. And I was very reluctant to do this because I'm pretty sure that the law school pays for AI models out of the same budget that they pay me out of. And as a consequence, I figured, well, maybe there's another solution. And there wasn't another solution. But there was a kind of compromise. So we don't need the smarter model, in this case, Claude Sonnet, which is Anthropic's mid-tier model. We don't need it all the time. We just needed sometimes. And so we made our first real staffing decision, I guess you could call it, which is, we hired a supervisor. And so when the Haiku worker model got stuck, it could escalate this issue to a supervisor that was powered by Sonnet that would cost more, but would hopefully save me from having to do any work at all. So this is the sort of thing that the supervisor model would handle. So there are pages that just don't load at all. Now, I've put certain things like, so if we take something like a source went dark, that could just mean that this source isn't available anymore. If it's something like Cloudflare or a 403 error, maybe a 403 error as a consequence of Cloudflare, that's because that particular source takes a dim view towards automated access. And so the supervisor can at least note this. But this is not something that is, the solution to this is not a simple one, because this is not just a technical measure, and a technical obstacle to be overcome, obviously. But at least I can know about it. But more often, the supervisor would encounter problems that it could actually just completely solve. Maybe the deadline was complicated. I mentioned that deadlines turned out to be more complicated. Well, I mean, it's not just a matter of, submit by this time. Sometimes, especially when we're dealing with publications and not, say, a conference, there's a window. So, there's an opening period as well as a closing one. Sometimes the window is kind of vague. We start taking submissions, in early January. Sometimes you have rolling submissions. Sometimes you have combinations, rolling submissions within a window fuzzily defined. And this sort of thing, a Haiku would not be able to do reliably. And then, there were other interpretive issues that the Sonnet supervisor model, that I mentioned up here, was capable of dealing with. So this was essentially the flow. If the Haiku worker model was not capable of handling the issue, or it failed somehow without raising an escalation, but the failure could be detected, then an escalation would be created automatically. And in those cases, we would have the supervisor investigate, and hopefully that was it. Heaven forbid I should have to do anything. But it turns out that sometimes I do have to do something. If the supervisor agent is still stuck, then a further escalation is created for human assistance, and these are things that I have to handle. Now, I do see all of the escalations, including the ones that I don't have to handle, so I have a view on what's going on. But the idea here is to try to automate as much of the labor as possible. And to some extent, that is in fact possible, but there is some residue of cases where that can't be handled. So, for example, a website like an OUP journal, for example, which has extremely strict automated access measures. In order for that to be handled, human eyes kind of need to be on the page, and so that's the sort of thing that, well, the idea would get kicked up to me. Now, Sonnet's really smart, and as a result, it was tempting to have Sonnet do more and more stuff. One thing that was, particularly tricky was identifying duplicate calls. And the reason this is a problem is that we don't want to send all of the calls that we've collected to the Haiku agent, because that's a lot of text. And the Haiku agent will then wonder, oh, what do I do? Or, we'll say, oh, oops, I forgot. It won't say that. It just will forget and will do the wrong thing. And so we just let the Haiku agent, give the call a name. And it's not always going to be the same name if it sees the same call in two different places. And so I was relying on the Sonnet agent to figure this out. The Sonnet agent also was able to take more actions, so it could actually look at existing calls that had already been collected and it could actually deactivate sources, for example, that seemed defunct. Haiku was limited to just collecting the information or escalating, where Sonnet could, take other measures. Now, in order to properly deduplicate calls, it turned out to be useful to collect the venues, which is, could be the conference or colloquium venue, but I also will just use that to refer to where it's from. So it could also be the publication. Because one way of deduplicating calls is just to ask, well, are these from the same venue? And then you can ask, is the deadline the same? And if they sound similar enough, then they're probably duplicates. But then you just sort of kick the can down the road, well, okay, call deduplication depends on venue deduplication. And in order to solve that problem, we would have Sonnet, the supervisor agent, whenever it saw a new venue, it would go check that venue out. So this was now a new kind of research. And it would ask, among other things, well, is this a peer review journal? Who's involved in publishing this? Where is this located? And it would draft a short paragraph. And when you have a description like that, and we would store these descriptions, we can actually compare the name of a new venue with the meaning of the description. It's kind of wild that this is possible. This involves creating a semantic embedding, and the technical details of that are a little a field of what I want to get into here, except that it allows us to compare the name of a new venue collected, with a description of other venues that was created when they were first investigated by the more intelligent escalation agent. And it allows us to make these comparisons without actually invoking one of these expensive agents. Using semantic embeddings is a kind of AI application, but it is extremely cheap. Even so, the supervisor agent ended up doing kind of a lot. And by kind of a lot, I mean it was getting expensive. So, when there's a problem with the way you have organized the labor, well, maybe we just reorganize the labor into a more efficient system. And so that is what we ended up doing. We have a junior supervisor that is powered by the cheap Haiku agent, and the senior supervisor, which is still powered by Sonnet. And this particular division of responsibility was used specifically for investigating venues, because although it's cheap to compare the name of a new venue with a description of existing venues, it's not cheap to do the initial investigating in order to describe the original venue to begin with. And because we were relying on these descriptions to do deduplication, every single new venue that the docket encountered would result in an expensive escalation. And so now we still get an escalation, but we have the cheap model doing most of the research. And the expensive model will just judge the research unless it decides that the research was inadequate, and then it can continue to do the research if necessary. And this is meaningfully cheaper than just doing the expensive agent for everything. Now, I've mentioned a number of different agents. I have not covered them all. These are examples of some of the agents I've mentioned and some that I haven't. In particular, I'll call attention to the deadline reader. So the deadline reader handles these complex deadlines now. Instead of relying on the expensive Sonnet agent, we now rely on the cheaper Haiku agent, but it's a different Haiku agent. You see, originally, it was the agent that found the call that would also be responsible for extracting the deadline. But because the deadlines can be complicated, and because dealing with those complicated deadlines involved drafting, some elaborate instructions, the way to make that reliable without using the more expensive agent was to just hire another cheap agent. And so once the original agent, the haiku agent, was done, finding the call, and naming the venue and and describing the call itself, it would then hand all of this off to the deadline agent, and the deadline agent would not have to worry about how to find this call to begin with. It wouldn't have to navigate from the blog, to the the journal page and then click on a PDF and read a PDF. It could just think about the deadline. So this is an example of instructions that the haiku agent, the original one, the one that chases down calls from sources, gets. This is not all of it. All of it is kind of long, but these instructions, especially the first, you'll see, are meant to help the agent sort things that are calls from things that look sort of like calls but are not. So I remember there was a publication that was looking to hire an editor. And so they put out this call for editors. And this call for editors appeared next to calls for paper on a much earlier version of the docket. And so I had to clarify that. And then there were other opportunities, summer schools, for example, they were advertising, they were soliciting applications, and this is not the same kind of a audience, that might be interested in calls for papers. I've talked a lot about these agents, and I figured, well, why don't we just watch one? Now, discretion being the better part of valor, I decided that I would video this rather than demonstrate this live, also in part because the escalations are changing all of the time, as are the sources to be scraped and so forth. So let's see. So normally, by the way, the agents do not have to open real browser windows, but it is possible to have them do that. And this was originally a diagnostic tool, but also helps you help them out if you are so inclined. So it opens a browser to the source, and you'll see some activity on the right side. So what happens now when there are two sources is that the original agent will create multiple sub-agents. And these sub-agents will now read the leads that the original agent found and will attempt to extract them. And so that extraction is complete. And this is an example of one of the extractions. This is from the administration dashboard. So it's describing the journal here and the opportunity, and we have a link, and this is what you get when you click on the card on the docket for this particular call. Now, there are things that changed, and there's also something that didn't change. The things that changed are pretty obvious. Here we're orchestrating agents, in order to do some job that is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to do with normal program logic. We're using AI models, the thing that just wasn't really something that people contemplated until very recently. But there's also something that didn't change. It turns out that in order to get AI to do this, you have to divide responsibilities. You have to recognize when one agent is doing too much. You have to recognize when certain work is just beyond the capability of one agent. And then you need to decide, well, do I need a more skilled, more expensive employee? Do I need to divide this work among several employees? Here, employees, so to speak. The thing that hasn't changed is that this is work that requires staff of some kind. And for years and years, that meant law librarians for Georgia's Calling All Papers, for Legal Scholarship blog. So what does that mean for the human, right? There's this phrase that goes, that's being bandied about, the human in the loop. Well, where's the human in this loop? So as you saw, I am in the flowcharts, most of them at any rate. Unfortunately, I wish I could just do absolutely nothing, but I can't do absolutely nothing because I have to make sure that the work ultimately is competent. So at least in this case, the role of the human was to supervise the supervisors. The human gets a promotion. And it requires fewer humans, less time, and at least in this particular application, where I imagine that the institutional support for having real-life human beings do work that required, at least at the time, human intelligence wasn't there. This kind of application of AI has no losers. Obviously, there are situations where that will not be the case. At the moment, the Docket is doing pretty well. Most escalations are automatically resolved. At least as of this moment, there are 2 escalations that are open right now, and I will have to end up reviewing at some point. Usually I'll look in, once or twice a week, spend maybe 5 or 10 minutes taking care of it. It still requires human labor, but, not that much. And from the perspective of the University of Hawaii, the Richardson School of Law, it's not free. We have to pay for hosting, and we have to pay for AI API calls to pay for those for the intelligence that Claude Sonnet and Claude Haiku provide. But as far as a website that is aimed at a large-ish community is concerned, I don't know. I feel like if it's $170 a month, or law librarians who have work that they're paid to do, and that this is this sort of thing would be a labor of love, as it were. I think choosing between that and asking of a human being to do this kind of work, well, I think like if you put it that way, maybe this is the better alternative. So here it is, or rather, here it will be. It occurred to me, if the last slide says here it is, maybe I should actually bring it up. So this is the docket at the moment. And, check it out. If it's gotten something systematically wrong, please send me an email, lawcode@hawaii.edu. If you have any suggestions, I'm all ears. And with that, well, do you folks have any questions? Oh, yes, certainly. Yes. Okay, so the question is, wouldn't it have been cheaper to use a local LLM? Yes, it absolutely would have been cheaper. It's possible to run an LLM on a computer that you have under your desk. At the time that I was developing the docket, they were not quite, they're sort of hit or miss. If you use something like Qwen 3.6, a local LLM, and you can use a sufficiently large version of it, and by sufficiently large, I mean the version of it that requires more video memory. Sorry, this gets a little bit technical. But if you have the hardware for local LLM, then theoretically you are just paying the price of electricity. One of the advantages, though, of using AWS Bedrock, so that's Amazon Web Services, AI endpoint, is, however, that it's a lot easier to switch language models. If it turns out you need something that is seriously, intelligent, it's very easy to outrun the ability of the hardware you have under your desk. But I actually did experiment a couple months ago with using Qwen 3.6, and it can do the job that Haiku does. So like clicking on the links and finding the call. That is absolutely worth experimenting with. Yes.
Are you thinking about transitioning this sort of system? Should you win the lottery and move away from Hawaii, or leave and go to a different role? Sorry, Brian, I'm not poaching. Promise I'm not poaching. But I'm always thinking about how to continue managing something. So if you create something like this that is so customized, if nothing else from your brain, right? Like that you figured out how to make this work. How do you teach somebody else how to manage it? Can it be managed?
Yes, it can be. So this is the original problem, right? Ultimately, if it's unsustainable, then that identifies a structural problem, with how you were imagining this would be run, and if you can't sustain an AI run website and scraper, then you're back to the original problem, that afflicted human-driven approaches like calling all papers and legal scholarship blog. So there is actually an administration dashboard that I am hoping is simple enough that someone determined to keep this going would be able to do so. But beyond that, to the extent that there needs to be some kind of technical expertise here, it's a different kind of expertise. So this can become an IT problem. And that kind of expertise is available. And if someone is willing to fire up, I mean, at this point, you could fire up one of those vibe coding agents like Claude Code or Cursor and so forth, and say, there's something wrong with the website. And at this point, odds are, you might actually just fix it that way. I actually realized something earlier today. So I had not thought as hard as I should have about time zone issues, and so I was pulling up the docket to make sure it didn't embarrass me in case I alt-tabbed to it as I did now, and I saw that there were some cards that seemed like they were off by a day. And the thing is, they weren't off by a day. They were fine in Hawaii, where most people aren't going to be using it. And I thought, okay, I don't have time to get into the weeds right now. I'll fire up Claude Code, and I'll just complain about it. And it was fixed in 5 minutes. So the sustainment story, I think, is at least partly here, and it is more sustainable than just requiring someone to just read a bunch of stuff and write a bunch of stuff, when in reality, their expertise is just better deployed elsewhere. Yeah.
Sort of accuracy threshold for your skills. like take for example, a deadline calculator, deadline determiner. At what point did you, did you test it empirically to say like, well, if it gets it right 98% of the time, then you let it slide? Or do you just say, well, it looks like it's working and you let it go? It strikes me that in this case, the stakes may not be as high because worst case scenario, you go to the page and say, oh, I have an extra day to fill this out or whatever. But for faculty who are looking for something to quantify, for example, if you're scraping, say, judicial opinions and want to determine the judge for that opinion, is there a way that you can quantify that?
That's a really interesting question. So in this particular application, I was just eyeballing it. And if I noticed that there was something wrong, I would know, all right, well, I need to look into that logic. This was also a sort of there were certain parts of the problem that were a little tricky. It's like if they say, well, early January, like what does that mean? But I hear what you're saying. And I have in other projects tried to deal with that sort of thing. One of the things that part of the story of AI in development of projects like this is that if you want a more rigorous examination of how well a particular component works, you can absolutely do it. And so you can set up tests where you have a corpus of test cases. So one of my other pet projects is a citation validator application. And you can collect a corpus of a bunch of filings where the folks filing got in trouble. And you can see, how many of these get caught. Now, depending on the kind of application, you might not, be able to come up with something that, approaches an exhaustive list of everything that ever happened. But if you want to use quantitative methods in order to determine whether your solution stands up, whether it's just traditional old-fashioned programming or you're making a call to a language model, you can absolutely do that. Yes.
Here, and I have a question about it. See that you have categories there. I myself, my IT professional. Can you tailor your tool to those two worlds so I can use it to find conferences that I can use?
So I assume these are things that overlap with IT work that are not captured by the category list at the moment. Yeah, that's pretty broad. Yeah, there are a number of categories where I think there could absolutely be better coverage. As far as the interdisciplinary question is concerned, I actually do that for one discipline, which is philosophy, because there's there's a fair amount. Well, I don't know, fair amount is quite the right word, but there's a meaningful overlap between law and philosophy publications, or publications like jurisprudence that publish both, and that means that I have to scrape philosophy sources. And when I decided to scrape philosophy sources, I immediately encountered another problem, which is that there were things that if the agent were forced to choose a category, it would choose a legal category for something completely inappropriate. So there might be something in epistemology that would get put into the evidence bucket, and that would be, I don't know, it would be a kind of interesting. I don't know. I would love to see the face of the professor, who thought, all right, well, I'll go look into this evidence opportunity, and this was about the Gettier problem and the nature of justified true belief and the fake barn problem and stuff like that. And so as a consequence, there are now a whole bunch of philosophy categories, and so expanding into another discipline is absolutely possible. But it means, at least as far as I can tell, you have to expand the taxonomy to attempt to capture, the kinds of categories that discipline offers as well. Yes. My next project. Oh, I'm going to replace all lawyers. Yeah. Yeah, I have a couple. I have that citation validator, you know. That turns out to be a tricky problem because I was actually kind of hoping to run into someone, you know, some of the free law folks here because oh, all right, yeah, I got an email, I think from Mike Listener after I called their API 1,000 times, like, okay, all right, see, you're building something, so what's up, you know? The hard problem there, that is another kind of research problem, and you can use something like Court Listener in order to determine if the citation is, you know, answers to something real. But then, you know, well, maybe it's a real citation, but the case at that citation has absolutely nothing to do with what it was cited for. And then, you know, well, what do you do? Well, you can use AI for that. Well, I don't know. That's kind of circular, though, right? If you're worried about AI hallucinating, you're going to trust it, and there is a solution to that. And then, you know, I have another thing, which is simulating a federal litigation. And that's a kind of interesting process, and it's an interesting challenge because it requires an open universe, an open legal universe. And so, you know, you can orchestrate many agents, you know, you have the defendant and the defense counsel's firm, and likewise for the plaintiff and the judge, and you know there are all sorts of things. It turned out to be extraordinarily complicated, but weirdly not impossible. And I hope at some, you know, not too distant, you know, at some point that it's not too distant in the future to be talking about something like that as well. There's certainly some sort of potentially interesting things that are on the horizon, I'm hoping. Gee, are we, I haven't exhausted the curiosity in this room, have I? All right, well, in that case, I won't stop you from the snacks outside. Thank you very much. And I hope this helps you and your faculty.